Welcome back to the Perfectly Homeless podcast.
We've spent 50 episodes scoring U.S. states on this exact system. Now we're taking the same scorecard global.
And right off the bat, you should know that homelessness looks radically different depending on which country you're in. So today we are building a scorecard for Japan, and this score will actually evolve dynamically throughout the show.
Right, it won't just be revealed all at once at the end. We're going to build it as we evaluate each category.
Exactly. So let's jump straight into the country overview. When you look at the scale and demographics of homelessness in Japan, the official government numbers are, well, they're pretty staggering, right?
Yeah, they really are. If you look at Japan's official statistics for 2025, they claim a massive 90% drop in visible street homelessness since 2003.
Wow.
Yeah, they report a record low 2,591 unhoused people nationwide. And officially, over 90% of those individuals are middle-aged or elderly men.
But if you're listening to this and picturing the U.S. baseline, visible street encampments, tents on the sidewalk, you kind of have to throw that image out, right? Because that low number is essentially a statistical illusion.
It absolutely is.
There are hundreds of thousands of people who are actually part of what's called the invisible homeless population. They're living in 24-hour internet cafes, capsule hotels, or their cars.
Right.
This heavily impacts irregular workers, who are known as freeders. It also impacts runaway youth, called Toyoko kids, and women fleeing domestic abuse. They're just completely hidden from the official count.
Yeah, and to understand those systemic patterns, you have to look at the macroeconomic origin of this. It all goes back to the burst of the 1990s bubble economy.
Ah, right, the lost decade.
Exactly. That era basically ended the traditional system of lifetime employment in Japan. It was replaced with highly casualized, low-wage, irregular labor.
Yeah.
But while the economy changed, the cultural expectations didn't. So poverty became deeply stigmatized. Unlike the U.S., Japan's homelessness is highly sanitized, it's kept indoors, and it's intensely hidden due to this extreme social shame.
Which brings us perfectly to the first category on our 6-category scorecard, housing affordability. What does the lived reality actually look like for someone trying to rent an apartment in Japan?
Well, the upfront capital required is just immense. To secure an apartment, you don't just pay a standard deposit.
Yeah.
First, you have a security deposit, which is called shikikin.
Okay, that's pretty standard.
Right, but then you have to secure a legal guarantor, a hoshinin.
Wait, like a cosigner?
Exactly. Someone who takes on the legal and financial burden if you default. And if you don't have a wealthy family member to do that, you have to pay a hefty fee to a guarantor company.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then comes the biggest hurdle, which is key money, or reikin.
Reikin, what is that exactly?
It literally means gratitude money. It's a non-refundable cash payment made to the landlord simply as a thank you for allowing you to rent the apartment.
Wait, seriously, you have to pay a bribe just for the privilege of signing a lease?
Basically, yeah. It's a deeply entrenched cultural tradition. So when you add all that up, it usually requires several months of your salary paid entirely up front.
Man, that's brutal, because if you're one of those irregular workers making, say, 100,000 to 120,000 yen a month, you're entirely locked out of the market.
Completely locked out.
So this is where those net cafe refugees come in, right? Because they're paying, maybe 1,500 to 2,400 yen a night for a tiny private cubicle.
Yeah, exactly. They just live in these little internet and manga cafe cuticles.
It's like a subscription lifestyle you can't cancel. Paying daily hotel rates completely burns through all your cash, making it mathematically impossible to save the lump sum you need for a real lease.
Yep, it is a permanent poverty trap.
So this lowers the overall picture for sure. Let's move to the second category, shelter access. What is the government doing about this?
Well, back in 2002, they passed the Special Measures Act, which funded these massive shelters. A prime example is the Hamakaze shelter in Yokohama, which has 250 beds.
Okay, so the beds are there.
They are. But today, many of these huge shelters actually sit half empty.
Wait, why are they empty if there are hundreds of thousands of people hiding in internet cafes?
Because of the lived reality for the invisible population, particularly women. Women are heavily unrepresented in these official shelters.
Really? Why is that?
Because visible street sleeping for women is incredibly stigmatized in Japan. When welfare workers see it, they quickly try to move them. But many women actively avoid these male-dominated shelters to avoid assault and the deep social shame.
So they just hide instead.
Exactly. They hide in commercial spaces or in their cars.
But look, if the government builds a 250-bed shelter and it sits half empty while 4,000 people sleep in net cafes across the city, Are we measuring the success of the shelter or the failure of the outreach?
That's the exact question critics are asking.
So, based on this, the current draft score is taking a serious hit. Let's look at Category 3, criminalization and enforcement. How do the police handle people who are out in public?
So that same 2002 law allowed authorities to aggressively clear public encampments. Now, parks are routinely locked at night. They've also installed what people call meme benches, architectural designs specifically made to prevent anyone from sleeping on them.
Right, hostile architecture.
Yeah. But it goes beyond that. Japan has incredibly strict weapon laws, known as jutushu. Under this law, car dwellers who have basic cooking knives or utility knives can face immediate arrest during routine police questioning.
Just for having a kitchen knife in their own car.
Yes, it's strictly enforced. Now, to be fair, supporters of these enforcement policies argue that they are necessary to maintain public order. They point out that these laws keep public spaces incredibly clean and safe for all citizens.
Right, I mean, you can't really argue against clean and safe parks.
Exactly, and supporters note that these strict policies were instrumental in driving that 90% reduction in visible street homelessness.
But critics contend that these policies are basically just spatial displacement, right?
Yeah.
You're just pushing the problem out of sight into cafes and cars without actually solving the root economic causes.
Yeah, that's exactly the critique.
You're effectively punishing individuals for carrying the tools they literally need to survive.
So this shifts the score again. And actually, before we move on to the next category, let's put up our preliminary score overlay.
Good idea.
So if you're watching, you can see the draft score clearly labeled on the screen right now.
But I really want to emphasize to you that this is not the final score. The remaining categories deal with some intense systemic issues, and they may significantly change the final result.
Exactly. So let's get into category 4, vehicle dwelling friendliness. We mentioned people hiding in their cars. What's that like? So this is known as shachuhaku, or vehicular homelessness. It's really common out in the suburbs. It's usually driven by sudden job loss, like there was a well-known case of a former dentist who lost everything after COVID, or it's driven by natural disasters like the 2011 tsunami.
So where do they actually park safely?
They rely heavily on michinoeki, which are these government-run roadside stations. They offer 247 parking and clean restrooms.
Oh, that sounds like a great resource.
It is, but it's a huge legal gray area. See, resting to recover from fatigue is legally permitted, but lodging actually living there is strictly prohibited.
Wow, so it's like living in a life raft. It keeps you from drowning, but the authorities constantly tell you that you aren't allowed to drop anchor anywhere.
That is a perfect way to describe it. They face extreme isolation. Sadly, some even pass away completely unnoticed in their cars.
That is just heartbreaking, and this lowers the overall picture for sure. Which naturally leads to Category 5, outreach and social services. Why isn't the government safety net catching these people?
Well, Japan's welfare system, called seikatsuhogo, is actually incredibly robust on paper. It covers rent, medical, and living expenses.
Okay, so what's the issue?
The bureaucratic barriers are just devastating. First, you need a registered physical address, a juminhash, to access services.
Wait, but you lose your address when you become homeless.
Exactly. It's a massive catch-22. And on top of that, there's the asset utilization trap. Applicants must legally sell off their assets to get welfare. But for a vehicle dweller, their car is their home.
So wait, how can a safety net function if the price of admission requires you to surrender the only form of shelter you have left? That makes no sense.
It doesn't. And it gets worse for victims of abuse. The system conducts family support inquiries, known as fushukai. They contact your extended family to see if they can pay for you before the government steps in.
Oh, wow. So if you're hiding from an abusive partner or family member, you can't even apply without tipping them off.
Exactly. They completely hide from the welfare system to stay safe. So NGOs like Moyai and NPO Huboku have to step up and fill these massive gaps.
Wow. Yeah, this shifts the score heavily. But let's look at the final category, pathways to permanent housing. Is there any way out of this trap?
There is, and that's the most frustrating part. Japan has proven models of success. Between 2004 and 2009, they ran the Moving to Community Living project. It used a direct housing-first approach.
So just bypassing the shelters entirely.
Yes. They moved nearly 2,000 people directly from parks into subsidized apartments, and they saw an 80 to 90% retention rate.
That's incredible. So Japan actually knows how to fix this. They proved it works. But the rigid traditional rental system and the bureaucracy just block the pathway for the most vulnerable.
Right. Nonprofits are left fighting the system, advocating for virtual addresses, and trying to use IKEA, which are vacant homes, to house people because the national political will just lags so far behind.
Well, this raises the overall picture a bit because the model exists even if it's struggling to scale.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, let's summarize the major strengths and weaknesses before we give out the grades. The strengths are undeniable. Clean public spaces, incredibly comprehensive welfare laws on paper, and a highly dedicated NGO network.
But the weaknesses are just as stark. You have this extreme invisibility, incredibly rigid bureaucratic gatekeeping, punishing asset rules, and a poverty trap driven by massive upfront rental costs.
Right, so let's assign the letter grades for the 6 categories. Housing affordability grade, shelter access grade,
C+,
criminalization and enforcement grade,
C,
vehicle dwelling friendliness grade,
B-,
outreach and social services grade,
C-,
pathways to permanent housing grade.
B-.
Which brings us to the final reveal.
The final perfectly homeless country score for Japan is a C+. Japan receives this score because its immaculate public spaces and bureaucratic barriers have successfully hidden homelessness rather than eradicated it, leaving a massive shadow population trapped in net cafes and vehicles.
In Japan, the streets may be spotless, but visibility is not the same as a solution because sometimes the most profound poverty is the kind you are forced to hide.
That's the perfectly homeless country score for Japan.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on the next one.